I made a mistake.
No, we are live.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Chronicle TV. With me is my co-editor of the Palestine Chronicle, Romana Rubio. Today, we are going to be discussing a very important subject that is that of Palestinian and African American solidarity. It's a very important subject for more than one reason. On one hand, the similarities between the struggles of Palestine and our African American brothers and sisters in this country. On the other hand, the similarities between the methods of oppressions that are being used by American police and by the Israeli army of police against Black people in this country and against Palestinians. Now, there is so much between these two struggles that matter. And that goes beyond mere words and into an actual historical trajectory that dates back decades. And today we are going to try to give you a glimpse of that, the intellectual, historical, and artistic overlap between the Palestinian experience and the Black experience in this country. So we are going to start here with a quote. First, our statements of solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters in this country. I will start by reading a brief statement of support by the BDS movement that was issued yesterday. The genocidal destruction of Native American nations, the pillage of their wealth and resources, and the savage enslavement of millions of Africans constitute the most profound pillars of what became the US. The deeply seated white supremacist ideology that has guided and attempted to whitewash these crimes is still alive, albeit in different forms. This exclusionary ideology is encouraged by the flagrant racist Trump White House and an insidious, less audaciously racist liberal establishment that rhetorically condemns racism, even spews some empty promises, yet constantly fails to act on racial and economic justice and ending the horrific system of criminalization and mass incarceration of Black Americans. To our Black brothers and sisters, your resilience in the face of brutal dehumanization is a source of inspiration to our own struggle against Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. We support calls such as this initiative from Minneapolis organizers to divest from militarism and policing and instead invest in community-led health and safety. We cannot breathe until we are free from oppression and racism. Black Lives Matters.
Now, and Ramzi, it wasn't only BDS who expressed its solidarity towards what's happening in the United States. Even BNC, which is the largest Palestinian civil society coalition that works to lead the global campaign for the BDS against Israel, stated, "We call on the Palestine solidarity movement in the US and elsewhere to stand with the movement for Black lives and other Black-led organizations in their righteous struggle for justice and for an abolitionist approach to police reform, reparation, and liberation. We endorse calls for targeted and strategic boycott, defunding, and divestment campaigns against institutions, banks, and corporations that are implicated in the system of racial injustice."
That's right. And we are only reading some of the statements by the most visible and representative Palestinian organizations, although there are many other organizations that have issued statements throughout the occupied territories, even from besieged Gaza, showing solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters in this country. Just a very brief statement from Al Auda. It's a long statement, but I'm just reiterating one line from it. Al Auda is the Palestine Right to Return Coalition. We recognize that our liberation as Palestinians is bound together with the liberation of Black people, and that our movement must stand clearly with the targets of US racism and imperialism domestically and internationally. Now, Romana, it's important to say that these statements of solidarity are really kind of the outcome of, as I said earlier, this long trajectory of overlapping historical narratives that also overlap in the field of art and other forms of expressions. Now, let's just look at a couple of artistic expressions coming from a Palestinian American poet, Sohair Hamad, that you will be reading right now.
Yes, absolutely. Also because of course, in both movements, art and poetry is part and parcel of the resistance movement. This is an excerpt from Born Palestinian, Born Black. Black, like the cold diamonds, are birthed from, like the dark matter of the universe. The Black September massacre of Palestinians, the Arabic expression to blacken your face, meaning to shame. Black, like opposite of white, the other. Indians in England, Africans in America, Algerians in France, and Palestinians in Israel. The Schwarzer labor of cleaning toilets and picking garbage. Black, like the genius of Stevie, Zora, and Abdel Halim. Relative purity, like the face of God, the face of your grandmother.
That's very beautiful. And after we are done here, we are going to be sharing a link to the book by Sohair Hamad, a seminal book, Born Palestinian, Born Black. In the same book, she has a very beautiful verse that I'd like to read, and I think it's kind of applicable to what's happening in America today. Tonight, America is looking for an idol. Tell her not to look in the White House. Direct her to the poems of June Jordan, the diaries of Malcolm X, the survival of native nations. Tell her idols are born, not produced. Remind America of the idols she has murdered, exiled, silenced. Maybe those idols, human and complicated, have some answers for us.
And it is really interesting, Ramzi, that she mentions in her poem another African American poet, June Jordan, who went to Palestine and wanted to express her direct solidarity to the Palestinian people with a long and very touching poem titled "Moving Towards Home." And I am going to read just the final passage from Moving Towards Home. I was born a Black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room. And where are my loved ones?
Absolutely beautiful. Sorry, I have a little technical glitch here. I hope I sorted it out. Now, this is really interesting because we kind of always have to look at some kind of an intellectual framework that makes our understanding of our mutual history, that gives it a little bit more substance, so that we understand where we are coming from. So here's a statement, or a very, very short definition regarding the Zionist and the Western imperialist discourses and how they overlap by the great Edward Said in his book Orientalism. The entire tenor of Zionist and Western discourse about the Palestinians has been to reduce us to so problematic, eccentric, and unthinkable a level as to make our every effort to appear to be human only a confirmation of our dehumanized, permanently subaltern status. Now, why this is relevant to what's happening today? Look at the way that the US mainstream media, Romana, is framing the struggle for rights in this country. The idea that they are not protesters but rioters and attackers, that kind of degree of dehumanization, presenting them as the aggressors, that they are, being now discussed in the White House, the idea of turning the organizers of these protests into a local form of terrorism and so forth. It's very, very similar to the Palestinian experience. And that's what Edward Said is essentially saying, that it's all about using this kind of dehumanizing discourses in order for you to demolish the other, to erase the other, and to make the subjugation of the other entirely possible.
In fact, Ramzi, the concept of Orientalism was also seen by African American intellectuals who talked about a Black perspective of Orientalism. For example, in his essay, Orientalism, a Black Perspective, Ernest J. Wilson III writes, "To the Afro-American audience, all of this, what Edward Said said, should sound very familiar, for we are very much at home on such ground. The Black community has been subjected to a kind of internal Orientalism. Its members, too, have been defined as the other, to be feared and controlled. The dark, exotic native son, viewed as the near mirror image of civilized and respectable white people. The concerns and apprehensions of the dominant society are projected upon Black society. Black Americans, too, in the view of the oppressor, have their common appointed spokesmen and their anointed leaders. And like Orientalism as described by Said, the white study of the Negro problem, especially prior to the militants of the 1960s, tended to ignore the ever-present anti-imperialist or radical nationalist movement of Black history, at the same time that the white-controlled state apparatus repressed these same movements."
Now, what's really interesting about people going to Palestine to kind of see for themselves what is happening under Israeli occupation and apartheid, they come back with mixed experiences. Most people really kind of tend to kind of see a reality that they have not been prepared for. And they come back really, I think if they are open-minded enough, they can see the injustices meted out by Israel and Palestinians on a daily basis. But everyone kind of comes back with a different experience that is related to his own cultural, historical experience. South Africans, for example, when they go to Palestine, they immediately see themselves kind of being brought back in time to their own apartheid experience that they have experienced for decades under during the apartheid African regime. Now, what is really interesting is that African Americans, when they go to Palestine, it really creates this immediate connection, this rapport of solidarity, because they find themselves kind of really living their own experiences of the past. I'm reading a small passage here from Ajamu Amiri Dilihunt, writing in Black Perspectives, under an essay titled "The Interconnectedness of Black and Palestinian Struggle." In October 2018, I traveled to Palestine on a 17-day environmental justice and olive harvest delegation with a group called Eyewitness Palestine. Since I returned from Palestine, I have been pondering a meeting we had with Omar Barghouti, co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions BDS movement. In response to a question about building cohesive relationships with oppressed people across the world, Barghouti stated that the Black freedom movement in the United States is, quote, uniquely positioned to play a key and leading role in bringing together this coalition of the oppressed across the globe, end of quote. Barghouti's words have remained with me over the past few months, and I continue to ask myself how such a strong coalition can be actualized today as it did in the past. Indeed, Black support for Palestine has long existed. Key historical figures such as Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and Amiri Baraka, and various Black organizations, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, supported Palestine. Their position and work on Palestine was fundamental. My intention here is not to expound on the history of Black and Palestinian solidarity. Much has already been written on the topic by scholars. Rather, my interest is to understand this important history of Black support for Palestine as a tool to strengthen the contemporary Black freedom movement's Palestinian solidarity work. Now, here he goes on to quote Marc Lamont Hill in arguing that our support for Palestine has to be more than just words. Hill further states, we need a solidarity that is bound not just in ideology, but in action. Now, tell us a little bit more about Marc Lamont Hill, and if you could read just a little bit more from that statement.
Yes, of course. Marc Lamont Hill is an American academic, author, and activist. And in 2018, he gave a speech at the United Nations about Palestine. And particularly this quote, this sentence about Palestine got him fired from CNN. And, his story went viral on social media. It sparked outrage, of course, on social media. Marc Lamont Hill said at the United Nations, and that is the quote that got him fired, we have an opportunity to not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires, and that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Angela Davis, many of you already know Angela Davis, of course. She is perhaps currently the leading voice of African American internationalist struggle, a great intellectual who is, kind of the very definition of the organic intellectual by Gramsci's definition, for she was very much involved in the struggle herself, going back many years. And we are in Palestine, of course, thrilled to have Angela Davis kind of help us find that kind of further connection between struggle as well. And she has written beautifully about Palestine as well. Now, she visited Palestine in 2011. And briefly, this is what she says in her interview with Democracy Now! In 2019. She says, the trip that I made to Palestine in 2011 with a delegation of women of color and indigenous feminists was revelatory in a way that I had never expected. I thought that I was aware of the conditions in occupied Palestine, but when I visited Hebron and I actually saw signs that barred Palestinian automobiles and Palestinian pedestrians from certain streets, my response was, segregation in Alabama did not bar Black people from thoroughfares. So in many ways, it seemed to me to be even worse than the segregation of my childhood. I think the world needs to speak out against these conditions. The good thing, Romana, is that in fact there has been a lot of people speaking out and creating these kind of connections between the African American struggle and the Palestinian struggle. But we are also hoping to create even a wider network of indigenous struggles all around the world. Because this notion that colonialism has ended and everything is good and dandy at the moment is completely untrue. We went from one form of struggle into another. Indigenous peoples, whether in the United States, and we raise our voices also, taking this opportunity to raise our voices in solidarity and support with the Native Americans of this country, the indigenous people who have experienced all forms of genocides and killings and eventually complete marginalization and neglect, but also the indigenous people all over the world, throughout Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand. And this is a point that we have been trying to make over and over again, that we are only stronger in our unity. Now, there was a very beautiful display that I think took a lot of people by surprise. I think it was in 2000, was it in 2014 when the Ferguson events took place? Yes, I believe it was 2014 when the responses to the cold blood murder of Michael Brown sparked widespread demonstration in the United States. But what they did not expect, that thousands of miles away, there is a group of people who feel this sense of affinity with African Americans, and they would also rise in protest as well. Let me just share this comment from one of the Palestine Chronicle contributor and an author, Binay Blend. Hello, Binay, and hello to everyone who is listening to us right now. And, you know, just before I tell you more about Ferguson, we receive many messages from people. You know, what about Kashmir? What about Yemen? I mean, we can't possibly, you know, kind of state all the, you know, all the nations that are undergoing their own wars of freedoms and justice anywhere in the world. And we are doing our very best to kind of create these connections. But of course, it, you know, instead of asking us, why are you forgetting Kashmir? Of course, we're not. We just had a whole program about Kashmir just a few weeks ago, in which we actually, I had the honor to co-host the president of Jammu and Kashmir, along with Dr. Samuel Aryan from Istanbul. So we are doing our very best, but you also need to reach out and to create platforms and initiatives, and you are going to find us very willing and happy to participate and regarding that as well. So yes, our brothers and sisters in Yemen, in Kashmir, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Algeria, in Tunisia, and everywhere, we are standing with you in the same degree of solidarity as we do with African Americans as well.
And also yesterday, we published an article about Yemen, so I can link it in the comment section too.
Absolutely. So Susan, who's saying, do you raise your voices for Yemen? Yes, Susan, we do, actually, repeatedly. In fact, if you look at the Palestine Chronicle, you will find that we are covering Yemen, although we have very limited resources and we are trying to keep these resources focused on Palestine. We feel for our brothers and sisters in Yemen, and we are constantly publishing articles about Yemen. And if you look at the writings of Kathy Kelly in particular, you know, we are really trying to keep our readers abreast on this issue. But let me just make the connection with Ferguson very quickly here. In an excellent essay by Christian Davis Bailey called Black Palestinian Solidarity in the Ferguson Gaza Era. And I'm just going to read a couple of short excerpts from the article. Leading into summer 2014, no one could have predicted the actions that pushed Black Palestinian solidarity into mainstream focus. The police killing of Michael Brown and subsequent uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, sparked mass action across the country. Just as US outcry against Israel's 50-day war on the Gaza Strip reached its fever pitch, protesters from Oakland to New York chanted, "From Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime," and began to highlight connections between the two struggles. As the scenes in Ferguson unfolded after Brown's death, images circulated on social media revealed the face of the militarized police state to an even wider portion of the US population. And I'm going to stop here just to invite our readers to check out some of our work on the similarity on the training of American police. I think you have 33 states that have sent police officers to Israel to be trained on the brutal methods of suppressing protesters by Israel, or Israeli companies come to the United States to train the American police on these brutal tactics. So if you can't make the connection between our struggles because of the similarities of the actions and because of the nature of the demands for freedom and justice and equality between Black Americans and between Palestinians, at least care about this particular thing. The fact that the brutality that we see in American streets at the moment and the so-called urban warfare tactics that are being employed by the American police at the moment is actually exported to you from Israel, courtesy of Israeli right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. At least keep that issue in mind. Going on reading the essay. These images of people facing guns and tear gas while protecting their communities were not lost on Palestinians thousands of miles away. Activists from the West Bank and Gaza began tweeting not only messages of support for the uprising in Ferguson, but also practical advice on how to deal with tear gas inhalation. On the ground in Ferguson, Black protesters were surprised to receive support from people undergoing a 50-day Israeli assault in Gaza, as well as a crackdown by Israeli forces across the rest of historic Palestine. Immediately, protesters in Ferguson began sending images and messages back and waving Palestinian flags at demonstrations. Palestinian members of the diaspora circulated a statement of solidarity, while the Samidun Palestinian Prisoners Solidarity Network and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine also issued statements of support. An organic solidarity emerged from the ground up between communities bearing the brunt of state repression. The thing, Romana, that I find more interesting about all of this is that we know that the historic similarities between the two struggles have always been there, and we also know the likes of Malcolm X and James Baldwin and these other great intellectuals have spoken out against what was very clear injustice that was happening at the time, whether in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. But now I think for the first time, we are actually seeing actual networking that goes beyond intellectual diatribes, that goes beyond statements of solidarity into actual connection, tangible connection on the ground. And in my opinion, that is so very important.
Yes, and on these days in particular, there were connections on the ground, because in Palestine we have like a spike in violence from Israeli police too, and we had the killing, the murder of Ihad al-Halak, this autistic boy, and 32-year-old man actually, but his family said that he was like a 3-year-old child in Jerusalem, completely without any reasons. He was walking in the street, he was going to a school where he got basic education, and he was killed in the streets. So there were many protests, of course, throughout the West Bank, but also in the US, with banners saying justice for Iyad, justice for George. So this time, really, the similarities are unfortunately on the ground for the dramatic events that create this kind of interconnections. But there is like a true solidarity, as we were saying, on the ground with, slogans that are repeated from one continent to another. And I think this is really important. Also, yesterday, we reported about this mural that appeared on the walls of Bethlehem, on the apartheid wall, a very beautiful mural made by a Palestinian artist representing George Floyd on the apartheid wall. So I think this is not just symbols. It's not just symbolic. It's something more than that. It's something that takes it from the violence of the state as an organized form of repression, and it's a grassrooted form of resistance that both peoples are showing in a very mature way, I have to say, in a very strong way.
Absolutely. In one of the statements, we haven't read the statement, but Angela Davis spoke once about how the connection between the Black experience in America and the Palestinian experience is important also for making the Black experience an international one as well. Because let's admit this, for a long time, any conflict anywhere in the world is somehow becomes an American obsession, because they always kind of feel like there is a way that they can exploit that for political reasons. Now, it could be in Russia, it could be in Hong Kong, it could be in Egypt, it could be in Yemen, wherever it is, the American government bounces on that and they try to incorporate that into their ongoing propaganda. Uh, but whenever events take place in the United States, somehow it is treated as if it's a local struggle.
Mm.
This is a local American issue. It's not an international issue. Very rarely do you actually see statements of solidarity and support or human rights reports being issued by the United States, for example, by the United Nations, condemning the American government's treatment of their own people. This is the term that they constantly use. This government is killing its own people and so forth. And the American government somehow had some sort of monopoly on any event that takes place within its own borders. No one else in the world had that kind of monopoly. Now, the connection with the Palestinian struggle, because you had a massive pro-Palestine network all around the world, throughout campuses and organizations and NGOs everywhere in the world, having that connection has also taken the Black experience in the United States through these existing networks and organizations to become an internationalist experience as well. So here we are talking about intersectionality, the fact that we are networking at a level in which I am using your struggle to highlight mine, and you are using yours to highlight my struggle to highlight yours as well. And I think this is so very important. So the issue of intersectionality has to be highlighted between the Black experience and the Palestinian experience as well.
Yes, absolutely. It is really important. And also, all the levels of the struggle, because this is like a struggle, of course, against racism, but it's also a class struggle. It is also a struggle for not only for social rights, but also for economic rights, for basic rights of the human beings. And in this sense, this is, I think, the humanization of the struggle in its best form, because when the media tend to dehumanize protesters, saying that they are, violent and riots and all of this, we have to understand that this struggle is actually deeper than that, and the requests are really deep and really well articulated if we have the patience to listen to them, of course. And Ramzi, do you think there is like a strong intermediate body that can, channel all this energy that is clearly there in American society and that is about to explode somehow?
I do believe that since Ferguson, since that experience in 2014, we've had a different. The movement kind of ended up going into a whole new direction. It was no longer riots in the streets and looting of grocery stores and such, this kind of typical mainstream narration of what's happening in the US. We are actually talking about a social movement, an intellectual movement that is being built slowly. And it takes a long time for social movements to actually yield the kind of political leadership that is actually able to negotiate on behalf of the people. But I do believe that in the United States, we are beginning to see this. The Black Lives Matter movement ended up not being a transitory or a fleeting movement. It's still there, it's still growing and still building momentum and building alliances. And I think that is so very, very important. Now, the question is, how do we actually build bridges of solidarity and support between this movement and organic, intellectual, political, social movements all across the world? And in Palestine, we are offering, or not we are offering, we are practically there for years, trying to, insisting that the similarities between our movements is a compelling enough reason that we should, in fact, be at the forefront of this struggle together. And now, because our enemies, our colonizers, our oppressors in Tel Aviv are very much involved in the suppression of your protests and the muffling of your voices in the United States as well. So we have more than enough compelling reasons to, in fact, carry on with this solidarity. I thank everyone who have listened to us, and all of those who have contributed their comments and their feedback, and keep it coming on Facebook and elsewhere. Romana, you might want to remind our readers of our coverage of the events taking place in the United States right now.
Yes, we have several articles. Today we published an article from Jonathan Cook, an essay from Jonathan Cook, analyzing the violence, the state violence and the state power, the violence in the state power and the protests, which is really, really interesting.
Jonathan Cook is an incredibly thorough researcher, a very good writer, and we recommend that you read that particular essay. We also have another essay by Benny Blend.
Yes, it's really important because it is how Israel contributes to the militarization of American police. This is a really interesting matter because the similarities are not only on a theoretical point, from a theory point of view, or practical in the violence, but also in the techniques that U.S. police uses, because Israeli forces are training Western forces, including including U.S. police. So this is a really interesting matter. In fact, we have another open letter that we published, Don't Learn from Israel, an open letter to the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey. So there is this issue is recurring.
I think this is a very important strategy of really kind of pinpointing the practical elements in this sinister relationship between Israel and the United States in their suppression of Black voices in the country and Palestinian voices in occupied Palestine. I thank everyone who have listened to us today and shared our feed with others. Please do so. Go to the Palestinian Chronicle, learn more about our publication, about our coverage. Contribute to us if you can, so that we may carry on with our work and with our mission as long as possible. Thank you again, and we'll see you all on next Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 10 p.m. Palestine time. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.